All right, so I will be talking about cognitive neuroscience. This is like an overview of several different topics in cognitive neuroscience. The basic idea is that, is my thing still showing here?
Yeah, it looks
good.
good.
There we go. It looks good. Okay. So the basic idea here is that I'm going to touch on several different cognitive systems, starting with memory, but not being exclusive to memory. I'm going to go a little bit fast at the beginning. If people want me to slow down and spend more time on any one given topic, then we can always pick up and complete the rest of it later on. This is a basic slide that you would see in like day 2 of a cognitive neuroscience class called A Taxonomy of Human Memory. Just for, so I don't upset people that in the memory world, this is, obviously in debate. It's sort of a very basic model that people have spent a lot of time knocking down to some degree. All right, so this is a basic taxonomy of human memory. It can be divided into what's considered long-term memory versus short-term memory or working memory. I'll touch a little bit on working memory. Long-term memory is divided into a couple different components. Implicit memory, this is considered like memory for procedures, tasks, basal ganglia dependent processes, cerebellar dependent processes, and principally related to motor or other kind of physical actions. Then there's explicit memory. Explicit memory is considered declarative, meaning you're able to state it when prompted. And this is divided into 2 large categories, which is semantic memory, memory for facts and concepts, and episodic memory. And I'll talk a little bit about these different aspects. So I'm going to switch next to just my general introduction to what is episodic memory. Episodic memory is the ability to form novel associations between 2 things that previously did not have an association in your mind. So in the task you're seeing here, an example would be kitchen and hammer. Certainly people that are doing the task understand the concept of kitchen and hammer separately, but the task is making a specific demand that they make an association between these 2 items, which may or may not have been associated in their mind previously. And then when prompted, they're asked to give information about which of the things in this example, for instance, Obama was linked with, the word Obama. And the correct answer is, kitchen, but there's other options as well. This is then followed by a confidence rating and then for the response. The episodic memory task that I use often, or initially in my research, is called free recall. In free recall, an individual is given a list of memory items, some distractor period, and then asked to recall as many of the items as possible from the previous list only. Why is this episodic memory? Well, these items that you're seeing are common nouns. So they are things that the individual already knows, or the concepts are already known, but the association between the item and the specific time period during which the items were presented is the quote unquote novel arbitrary association that the individual has to make in order to complete the memory task. The distractor period, it could be anything. We use math, but the reason that you have to have a distractor period is to avoid the process of rehearsal and avoid that the individual is maintaining the items in what's called working memory before the period of recall. This basic idea, a novel association, especially with temporal information, i.e. the time at which the items were presented on the given list, followed by a distractor to avoid rehearsal / maintenance and working memory, and then a period of recall. This is a standard way to assay episodic memory. Episodic memory is, of course, highly hippocampal dependent. We think that the hippocampus is mostly necessary to form highly detailed associations between an item and what we call context or surrounding information. In the free recall task, that context is time. It's when the item was presented on the list. In the previous task that I showed, in the last one, that novel association is between 2, semantic concepts, kitchen, Obama, or whatever. So I'm not going to talk about hippocampus in this lecture as much, but the basic idea is that, or the one idea I want to convey, is that episodic memory is dependent on the hippocampus. It doesn't occur only in the hippocampus. Through a number of research, one of the quote unquote brain networks that I'm interested in is called the core recollection network. These are areas in the brain that tend to co-activate during episodic memory paradigms. You can see that while it does include the mesial temporal structures as reflected on the right side here, it also includes other extra hippocampal locations to a large degree, including medial prefrontal cortex, lateral parietal cortex, dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, and especially lateral temporal cortex. what you'll notice is that there is a slight posterior bias into where in the areas of the brain that are shown on this kind of canonical coactivation map, indicating that there's substantial parietal contributions to this process, but other areas as well. And then as the lecture goes on, I'll touch a little bit about how these networks, this brain network, interacts with other ones in the whole process. So now I want to bring up the concept of familiarity. All right, so this is Endel Tulving. So Tulving is a famous memory investigator, most active in the early to mid 1970s and then subsequently. And Tulving was the one to first propose the idea that there is a difference between remembering something and knowing it. What he was getting at is the idea of familiarity, i.e., when someone prompts me for a recall item or gives me a clue as to what the recall is, you can remember or you can vocalize a recollection based on two complementary but relatively distinct processes in your brain, one of which is based on familiarity and the other which is based on actual episodic recollection. The distinction is essentially the difference between being able to recall an item with all of its surrounding contextual information versus just being like, yeah, I saw that before. It's I'm familiar with this item. It's not the same as making a guess, but it's a less detailed and rich memory than if you're able to recall all of the surrounding details and associations that come with it. In episodic memory, this distinction is assayed often using what's called the remember versus know distinction, i.e. individuals could be prompted to say, do you remember it or do you just know it? The reason the cartoon is drawn is because Tulving was famous for arguing that humans alone have the ability to remember something, whereas animals just know it. That the episodic memory system is so highly evolved in humans that we have a fundamentally different capacity than that which exists in animals, even in non-human primates. It's a somewhat controversial topic, but it's one of the reasons that I chose to study episodic memory, because this is something you can only study in humans to a good degree. The last point I have on here, how is this different than semantic memory? I'll move on to semantic memory at the end if we have time, then I can get back into that. So how do we test versus familiarity versus recollection? One way is you can just ask them, do you remember it? Do you know it? Right. Another way is through what's called confidence ratings. That means when you ask somebody, if you prompt someone with a memory item, and you ask them if they've seen the item before, they can say yes or no, which should be based on either familiarity or recollection, or they can answer, and then after that you can prompt them, asking them, what is your confidence in making this judgment on a scale of say 1 to 6 is the most common. People for items in which people report high confidence, this is thought to be more episodic in nature, and the representation of the brain is thought to be more episodic. Lower confidence ratings are thought to be based more on familiarity, and of course there's a gray area. There's other ways to do it, and this is how I do it, which is what's something called the associative recognition paradigm. So memory encoding, during the encoding period, you're given one of these like arbitrary associations. I use word-word associations because it's the most cognitively, it's what's considered process pure, meaning that you're not conflating the information represented by the memory item with things like color, other things that could affect the cognitive signal associated with it. It makes the task more boring. It makes the results, I think, more robust. So the individual is given all of these items presented together. The number, we changed the length of the list, but this is an example. And then at the time of retrieval, you see pairs of items. Some of those pairs of items are what's called intact, meaning that the pair is presented with its appropriate matched partner. So in this case, calcium and filter are presented correctly. And some of them are presented with the item was seen before, but now it has a different partner with it. For example, jail and orange. This is what's called a rearranged pair. Calcium filter would be an intact pair. Jail orange would be a rearranged pair. And you also include novel pairs, for example, tea and walrus. Then the individual is asked to make a judgment as to whether the pair is intact, meaning each item was presented with its appropriate partner. Rearranged, meaning that the items were seen before, but now they're matched with somebody else. Or novel, meaning that they weren't shown at all before. You can do a good job of teasing apart brain areas involved in familiarity-based judgments versus episodic recollection-based judgments by contrasting brain activity for items that were shown intact and are identified as intact versus those that are shown intact, but the individual says that they're rearranged. When the individual makes an error, it means that they did not form the high quality association characteristic of episodic type recollection. Does that make sense for people, the distinction there? So this is obviously a popular topic. This is one of my favorite papers on it. This is the question, just where they gave this task and tried to differentiate brain areas involved in recollection versus those involved in familiarity-based judgments. And that's reflected on the upper left side here, where the red-colored brain areas are more heavily involved in recollection, and familiarity-based judgments are brain areas that show activation exclusively on the familiarity-based judgments, which in the paradigm that I showed would be the intact rearranged items. They're presented intact. The individual knows they saw the items before, but they get the association wrong. Those are reflected here in green. And you can tease apart these different brain areas, and you can see, it's some of the areas that I'm interested in, including angular gyrus, lateral temporal cortex, dorsal prefrontal cortex. So then the question always comes up, well, HM, who dominated a lot of thinking about memory for a while, he suffered deficits in both recollection and familiarity. So why is that? Well, if you look at the actual resection that HM had, which is reflected in the upper right plot here, resection wasn't just the hippocampus. It was the hippocampus plus the temporal pole and rhinal cortex. And these sort of anterior temporal regions, rhinal cortex, are thought to are involved in to some degree in recollection processes, but also especially in familiarity-based retrieval. Other areas are as well, but that I think is it's thought that that's one of the big explanations for why he suffered deficits in both types of memory. If it had been a purely bilateral hippocampal removal, the familiarity-based deficit would have been not as extreme. Incidentally, he also had partial preservation of posterior hippocampal structures, which leads to which I think explains some of the preservation of abilities in spatial navigation, which I haven't touched on here. So you can tease apart contributions from episodic recollection-based recall, from familiarity-based, from novelty-based. There's a fascinating paper by a guy from Stanford and Anthony Wagner that gets into that point that I'm not going to get into. But this is a concept developed by Andy Ionelinas, which is signal detection theory. Basic idea here is that if I give someone a task, somewhat where I present, say pairs of items or whatever, or just an individual item, and I ask someone to tell me if they saw it before, yes or no. That could be either familiarity or recollection. And then I'm asked to give a confidence rating. You can look at the shape of the resulting receiver operating characteristic curve to understand whether or not the individual is making a recollection-based judgment or a familiarity-based judgment. So how does this work? Well, just a standard ROC curve. On the x-axis, you have a false alarm rate. On the y-axis, you have the hit rate. Hit rate means if you show them a new item, they call it novel. You show them an old item, they call it old. That'd be a hit. A false alarm means that they see an old item, they call it new, or they see a new item, they call it old. They make a mistake. If you adopt a strategy where you just say yes to everything, meaning any item you see, I'm saying, yes, I saw it before, then you'd have a false alarm rate of 1 and a hit rate of 1, which is, the characteristic of a curve, and also vice versa. If you say everything is old, you'll have a false alarm rate of 0, you also have a hit rate of 0, right? Ionelinas is well known for showing that for when people are using making recollection-based judgments in your task, you see a shift in the shape of the curve upward. So the curve that you're seeing at the right here, an asymmetry between the kind of upper right quadrant and this lower left quadrant, is characteristic of recollection-based judgments. So this kind of ROC-based theory is one way to tease apart recollection and familiarity. So let's move on. So Remy, if I give you this math task, tell me what brain system are you using to solve it? But in fact, because of the nature of the math problem, which I'll come to here, what is the characteristics of it? Well, in order to solve the problem, 6 plus 7 plus 5, what do? You have an intermediate stage where you hold the intermediate value, 13, in your brain, and then you add 5 to it. Very few of us in the world have memorized the fact 6 plus 7 plus 5. We may have memorized, so it's purely semantic memory, what 6 plus 7 is, but no one really goes around memorizing 3-step math facts, right? I'm sure someone does, but generally not. And as such, there's this intermediate quantity. There's an intermediate quantity you have to hold in your mind and then add the 5 to it, right? Does that make sense? Because there's the intermediate quantity, that makes this a working memory task, essentially. Now, in truth, there's also numerosity. You have to understand the magnitude, an understanding of these, like the number. What does the number mean? And that's a separate brain system involved in math processing, centered on the interparietal sulcus. That I'm not going to get into, but it's a whole kind of interesting area that I've also looked at cognitively. But for our purposes, we're calling this a working memory task. So what is working memory? Well, here's a standard paradigm that people use to talk about working memory. This is called the NBAC task. It's a standard way or one of the ways to assay working memory. So the way it works is that you're presented with a series of items. They could be letters, they could be something else. Letters are pretty standard. Items come one after the other. For each item that you see, you have to say, is it new or is it old? And in the schematic that I have here, the M indicates that it's old. So if you start with the letter A, when the first time you see A, it's new. You haven't seen it before. B, new. L, new. T, new. Now you see B. Your job is to just say, is B old or new? Well, you saw B before, so you're saying it's old. It's a memory item or whatever, right? The number of spaces between when it's shown and when you see it again is the N in the NBAC task. Does that make sense? So the more you span, the closer to 7 or 8 digit points you get to from your old item to your new item, the harder the task gets. And so a standard NBAC paradigm in our patients in neurosurgery would be probably a 2-back paradigm. Beyond 2, people start to perform pretty badly, at least our patients. I'm sure Aaron could go to like 24, but apart from Aaron, it's hard for people to do more than 4 or 5 of these NBACs. Anyway, but you can see how it's a similar idea to the math. There's an intermediate concept you have to hold in your mind, a certain number of items that you are keeping in your working memory to then report whether or not you saw it before. So one of the things I like to talk about is that if you ask me to predict somebody's general intelligence, how well will this individual do on a general intelligence test? And you could give me any variable I want. You can give me income, you can give me how well they did on the MCAT, you can give me whatever. The best predictor of it is going to be their working memory capacity or their working memory performance. People with effective working memories is the most highly single correlated cognitive item with full-scale intelligence measurements. So I have a slide here I'm going to ignore. Working memory, generally speaking, is thought to be associated in kind of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. If you had to pick one area. Depending on the individual stimuli, you would see activation in other areas as well. I mean, certainly for like the math paradigm, which relies on working memory, you would see activation interparietal sulcus because of the connection with numerosity. But generally speaking, it's thought to be a prefrontal process. Now, I have this next slide here because there is an intense debate in our field about the component of mesial temporal systems in working memory activities. Classically speaking, you would say no. People like HM were fine with working memory. They didn't have any working memory deficits. But if you do experiments where you give people working memory tasks, you see hippocampal activation. The debate in our field is like, well, is this because the hippocampus is simply activating because the hippocampus is always trying to encode? It's always trying to form a new memory, even when you're not necessarily wanting it to. Or is it because there's some actual contribution from the mesial temporal system to working memory? I don't know the answer to that question. This is an ongoing debate between people who are called single process and dual process people. I've done some experiments related to this, and it's very harder than you'd think to tease apart. If you ask me to like really pin me down and give you an answer, I would say I think that it depends on the complexity of the task. I think that the more complex the task becomes, the more detailed the item that you're supposed to be holding in working memory, it may then start to require hippocampal contributions. This is if you're interested in working memory and some really interesting physiology behind it. This Earl Miller at MIT, who I think is, on the track to win the Lasker Award, if not the Nobel Prize, has done some awesome stuff with working memory representations in prefrontal areas. What I wanted to do is just touch real quick on a couple of other cognitive processes. One of them is cognitive control. So this is a pretty standard cognitive control task. So the idea is that you have two different, it's called a task switching paradigm. So what happens here is these are the instructions. The way the task would work was you would show a bunch of shapes, right? And then the person gets pretty used to doing B or N based on whatever shape they're seeing. And then you switch to yellow, blue. Now you're showing them yellow and blue stuff. And now the B and the N that they had associated with having to answer the shape question is now associated with having to do something, a different thing. In this case, the color thing, yellow or blue. This is called a task switching paradigm. And it's a, Psych 101 type of cognitive control task. Using cognitive control tasks, you can identify cognitive control networks. And this is just a schematic showing one of the canonical cognitive control networks, which is shown here. You see the areas that are activating. I'm not going to get into salience, but salience is very subtly different than cognitive control, although they're highly overlapping. There's theoretically a distinct salience network. I want to stop on one last point, and then I'll be done for today. So you'll see in the world, you can take resting state data, meaning just look at someone's brain activity on MRI. You can do it with EEG, you can do whatever you want. And you can take a correlation between activity in region A and region B. And you can develop there's a correlation between the time series, gives you an estimate of connectivity. You can set different thresholds and try to determine which brain regions are connected to each other. This is a pretty standard task, and you may be tempted to use or a pretty standard analytical method, and you may find yourself using one of these in the future. One of the experiments that I really like related to this question was done at UT Austin, where they took people, it was the investigator plus some others, and they scanned them essentially every day for like a year. And they looked at how stable these networks are over time. Is anybody familiar with this experiment? It's pretty well-known one. So the idea is that if you, they found that, to their surprise, the areas of the brain that tended to co-activate on this resting state task were highly consistent over time. It wasn't like on day one, areas A and B were connected, and on day two, areas B and C were connected. It stayed pretty stable. The fly in the ointment for doing these resting state analyses, however, is that when you get at the individual level, the map that was generated based on individual level data is different than the map that you generate from group level data. It's not totally different. It's not like the motor cortex now becomes the sensory cortex or becomes the episodic memory system on Monday, and then on Friday it's back to the motor cortex. It's not like that. But for areas, especially for these more subtle cognitive functions, or areas that are related to but not the core area for a given network, you'll see some significant variation, and that's represented here. The takeaway is that you have to be careful of what, if you're transitioning from a group level claim, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is involved in working memory, to an individual level claim. I'm going to use the fact that the DLPFC is involved in working memory to do something to this individual. I'm going to stimulate it to enhance working memory. I'm going to use TMS to interrupt it, etc. You need to go back and demonstrate that the brain of the individual is organized in the way you think. And that's true for episodic memory. It's true for everything else. And that's why when you're starting to move from, we're just kind of setting the brain at the group level to, we're trying to do an intervention, closed loop brain stimulation or something else, you have to do something to understand the individual level cognitive organization. I think this fact is not controversial, but people can ignore it. And that was the fundamental error in some of the lectures that we may have seen here presented by external speakers. So I'll leave it at that and be happy to answer a couple questions if we have time for them.
Hey, Brad. For a while, Washington, like Loftus and all, were really pushing false memory. Is that construct being replaced with recollection, or the inverse, or You didn't mention false memory.
Okay, so what happens when I make a false memory, right? So let's say, so there's one option I'm lying. We'll throw that out the window. Option 2, I have a strong association between two items in my mind. I thought that, the word kitchen and the word Obama were really put together, and I firmly believe it, right? That would be a true false memory. A true false memory, if you held a strong association in your mind, is some kind of error in a hippocampal dependent association process, right? That is fairly rare. True for like false memories of that nature. The other kind of false memory, if we go back to the slide on signal detection theory, is looking at this question of the strength of the memory. Well, if you told me, yeah, that's right, and you say, well, tell me a confidence rating. Are you 100% confident? Are you 10% confident? And if you prompted them there, then usually for the things that are considered or memory errors, the confidence rating will be low. They're making a familiarity-based judgment that doesn't have the same detail of episodic judgment. Now, the wild card here is how many times you're asked to recollect the item. Because if you ask me if I have this weak association, confidence 2, and I say it, but then later on, they're like, someone brings it up and I recollect it again, over time, a low confidence judgment, erroneous association will turn into a relatively high confidence, strong association, right? So I think Malcolm Gladwell has a famous example of this in one of his books. He's like, on 9/11, I was at this person's house and we watched it together. And then later on, he talked to that person like, no, you weren't here. I don't know what you're talking about. You were whatever, somewhere else. And he was totally flummoxed because, he's Malcolm Gladwell and I don't know, whatever. But the basic idea is that because 9/11 comes up a lot, then he was, implicitly or explicitly recalling this weak, association that he had wrong to the point that it became a true false memory. So the areas of the brain, I think that there's some key connectivity patterns that can discern hippocampal dependent true false memories from low confidence errors, but it's a whole thing. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Another question?
Thanks,
Brad.
Yep.
Can I ask a question, Brad?
Sure, please.
That was a really nice review. So with memory, how much of it is innate, or can you teach memory? So if you have someone doing these tasks, will they improve their memory or just improve at the task?
Yeah, I mean, so there's two questions there. One is like, if I do perform to a certain level on an episodic paradigm, and then you give me that paradigm every day, how much am I going to get better on that particular paradigm, or how much will that training cross over into some other paradigm that's, memory related but distinct, right? So the answer is that there's about a 15 to 20% variation in performance on an episodic memory task for individual over time. So if you ask me how much better someone's memory can get by practicing on a given task, I would say about 15% better, right? Now, people always ask me, like, well, what about these, like, searching for Einstein people? They build the memory palace. They're walking through the memory palace. You can get, pretty good at certain types of like fact-based memory, etc., by spending a lot of time training on it beyond this 15% number. So it's not like an absolute ceiling, but once you start getting beyond 15%, you're moving beyond. I'm using the normal memory systems to do a standard memory task and into like, I've, developed some very high different cognitive approach to forming the memories. So then if someone gets a lot better, let's say at free recall, and I give them an associative recognition task, will they perform at their top level after doing very well in the free recall task for a while? I don't really know the answer. I would say that I would expect they to do a little bit better, just based on the practice effects that we see after doing 2 or 3 sessions of an item. But I don't think it would be the same as their improvement in performance on the free recall task, or like the task that they had trained on. And then the question, if I train myself forever on an episodic memory task and then you give me a working memory task, am I going to do better? Absolutely not. That's not the same system. But when we talk about the possibility of memory enhancement, what we're talking about is taking someone who's and pushing them up to that 15% improvement level that we think is realistic.
All right, thanks, Brad.